Right now, hold up one hand and look closely at your fingernails. Then close one eye and look at the world through just the other. Then open both eyes again and think about the last time you actually looked closely at your own eye color in a mirror instead of just glancing past it. Because if you did, and if you noticed that one eye is not quite the same shade as the other, you are looking at something that scientists have only fully explained in the last handful of years. And the explanation reaches back tens of thousands of years before either of your parents were born. Doctors call this condition heterochromia, and for most of medical history it sat in textbooks as a strange little footnote, filed next to conditions nobody bothered to fully investigate because it seemed rare, harmless, and unimportant. In small European clinics in the late 1800s, a handful of physicians began jotting down cases almost as an afterthought, describing a patient who came in for something unrelated and happened to have one blue eye and one brown eye, with no explanation offered beyond a shrug and a note calling it an oddity of pigment. One of the earliest detailed descriptions came from a German ophthalmologist working in the 1880s, who examined a young patient with mismatched eyes and, finding no obvious injury, no infection, and no family history that explained it, simply recorded the case and moved on, assuming it would eventually be understood as some kind of developmental accident with no larger meaning. For the next 100 years, that assumption barely changed. Families who noticed the trait in a newborn often had a similar reaction, treating it the way people treat anything they cannot explain, sometimes with quiet worry, sometimes with outright suspicion. In some households, an unusual eye color in a baby led directly to whispered questions about paternity, about a forgotten relationship, about some stranger who must have entered the family tree at some point nobody wanted to admit. Physicians were asked, gently but anxiously, whether the trait meant something was medically wrong with the child, or whether it was proof of something uncomfortable in the parent's history. In the overwhelming majority of these cases, the anxious guessing pointed in exactly the wrong direction because the real explanation was not sitting in a recent family secret at all. It was sitting in genetic material that had been passed down for thousands of years, long before any living relative had been born, long before the family even had the name it carries today. For a long time, the entire scientific understanding of eye color, and by extension heterochromia, rested on an assumption that nobody had properly tested. Light eyes and the pigment variations that produce mismatched eyes were assumed to have originated in one specific place, and to have spread outward from there to everywhere else, the same way a lot of traits get simplified into a single tidy origin story. Once one influential study gets published and nobody challenges it for a few decades, that assumption held up reasonably well as long as the technology to test it did not exist. Once ancient DNA sequencing became affordable and accurate enough to check details buried in bones and teeth thousands of years old, that assumption started falling apart, piece by piece, and the story that replaced it turned out to be stranger, older, and far more interesting than the simple version most people had been taught. To understand why any of this matters, you first need to understand what eye color actually is at a biological level, because the popular explanation most people carry around in their heads is not quite right. Your iris is not holding separate reservoirs of blue paint or green paint waiting to be revealed, depending on your mood or your genetics. There is really only one pigment involved in eye color, called melanin, and melanin only comes in shades of brown. Every other color you have ever seen in a human eye, blue, green, gray, hazel, is created by an optical trick, not by a different pigment. Think of it the same way a swimming pool looks bright blue even though the water itself is colorless, because of how light bounces around inside it and reflects back to your eyes. Eye color works in a similar way. A thick layer of melanin sitting in the front part of your iris absorbs most of the light that hits it and gives you dark brown eyes. The thin layer of melanin lets more light scatter and bounce back out, and because of how light physics works, that scattered light reads to your brain as blue, in almost the same way our atmosphere scatters sunlight to make the sky look blue, even though air itself has no color at all. Green and hazel eyes usually sit somewhere in the middle, often shaped by a small amount of melanin combined with a separate yellowish pigment called lipochrome, which adds a golden or amber tint to the mix. Heterochromia happens when this pigment balance is not identical in both eyes, and doctors actually break it down into a few different types, depending on how the mismatch shows up. Complete heterochromia is when one entire iris is one color and the other iris is a completely different color, which is the most dramatic and most commonly recognized version, the kind you might have seen in photographs and thought looked almost unreal. Sectoral heterochromia is when just a wedge or a patch of one iris breaks away from the rest, so you might see a slice of brown cutting through an otherwise blue eye, almost like a small triangle of a different color dropped into place. Central heterochromia is the subtlest version, showing up as a ring of a different shade circling the pupil, while the rest of the iris keeps its original color And it is common enough that a lot of people who have it never even realize it has a name, assuming their eyes are simply an unusual shade rather than technically two-toned. All three forms show up in every population on the planet, but they do not show up at the same rate everywhere, and that uneven distribution turns out to be one of the first real clues that something older and larger than pure random chance is happening underneath the surface. Now here is the myth you have almost certainly run into somewhere online or heard repeated as if it were established fact, the idea that mismatched eyes are some kind of mystical marker, a sign of psychic ability, a symbol of a special destiny, or proof that a person is somehow different at some deep spiritual level from everyone around them. This idea shows up constantly in folklore, in fantasy novels, in social media posts claiming that people with heterochromia have unusual personality traits or hidden abilities. It is a fun story, and it is completely unsupported by any actual evidence. Once researchers studied large groups of people with heterochromia at scale, comparing personality measures, cognitive test results, and general health outcomes against people without the trait, no meaningful pattern emerged that would support any of those mystical claims. What did emerge instead was something far less magical but genuinely more interesting once you understand it properly, which is that eye color itself is what geneticists call a polygenic trait. That simply means eye color is not controlled by one single gene acting like an on-off switch, the way some traits in old textbooks are described. Instead, it is shaped by the combined influence of more than a dozen different genes, working together, each one nudging the final outcome slightly in one direction or another. Two of the most important genes involved sit close together on chromosome 15, one called OCA2 and a neighboring gene called HERC2, which behaves almost like a dimmer switch, turning the activity of OCA2 up or down depending on which version of HERC2 a person inherited. Other genes involved include one called TYR, one called SLC24A4, and several others, each contributing a small piece to the final result. The same way dozens of small adjustments to a recipe can change the final flavor of a dish, even though no single ingredient decides the outcome by itself. With that many separate genetic dials involved in determining eye color, it becomes far more statistically likely than most people assume that two eyes developing on the same face could occasionally receive slightly different instructions during early development without anything mystical or supernatural happening at all. Sometimes this occurs through a process called developmental mosaicism, where a small, random genetic change happens in a single cell sometime after fertilization. So the group of cells that eventually forms one iris ends up carrying a slightly different version of the genetic instructions than the group of cells forming the other iris. It is a bit like photocopying a document a few times and having one copy come out with a tiny smudge that changes one detail, while the rest of the copies stay identical to the original. In rarer cases, heterochromia arises through a phenomenon called chimerism, where two separately fertilized eggs fuse together very early in development, before either one develops into a distinct embryo on its own, resulting in one single person who is technically carrying two genetically distinct sets of cells in different parts of their body. This sounds almost like science fiction, but it is a documented, well-understood biological phenomenon, and in some cases it can be confirmed through genetic testing that shows a person's blood carries a slightly different genetic signature than a swab taken from inside their cheek. Doctors are also careful to rule out a specific and separate condition before assuming heterochromia is simply this kind of ordinary genetic variation. It is called Waardenburg syndrome, and it can also produce mismatched eyes, but it typically comes bundled with other noticeable features, including a distinctive streak of white hair growing from the front of the scalp, eyes that sit unusually wide apart, and in some cases, hearing loss that shows up from birth. Waardenburg syndrome is tied to mutations in specific genes that guide how pigment-producing cells travel and settle during very early development, and it has nothing to do with ancestry or deep genetic history at all, which is exactly why doctors treat it as a separate, well-understood medical category, rather than folding it into the broader ancestral story being described here. Once Waardenburg syndrome has been ruled out in a newborn presenting with mismatched eyes, what usually remains is the far more ordinary explanation involving mosaicism, chimerism, or simply the natural unevenness that can occur when more than a dozen interacting genes are involved in producing a single trait. None of that ordinary biological explanation on its own tells you anything about ancient migration or deep ancestry, and for a long time, most scientists assumed there was nothing more to the story than that, a random roll of the genetic dice with no larger historical thread running underneath it. That assumption started to shift because of a discovery that had nothing to do with eye color at first glance. In the deserts of the Tarim Basin, in what is now western China, archaeologists had been slowly excavating an extraordinary field of naturally preserved mummies since the late 1970s and 1980s, bodies so well preserved by the dry, salt air of the region that their clothing, Their hair, and even fine details of their skin, had survived for nearly 4,000 years. Many of these mummies had features that looked strikingly different from populations living in the region today, including reddish or light brown hair and deep-set eyes, and for decades, the leading assumption was simple, that these were foreign travelers, wandering herders from far away on the western steppe, or traders who had drifted in from the Iranian plateau, following some ancient trade corridor centuries before anyone called it the Silk Road. That assumption held firm for decades, right up until the technology existed to actually read their full genomes in detail. When researchers finally sequenced the DNA of these mummies in a study published in 2021, the results overturned the entire assumption. Genetically, the Tarim Basin population showed almost no significant mixture from outside groups at all. They were not wandering foreigners. They were a genetically isolated local population descended from a much older group that geneticists refer to as ancient North Eurasians, a population that left almost no trace under its own name anywhere in the historical or archaeological record, and yet whose genetic fingerprint is scattered today across an enormous range of modern populations, showing up in Siberians, in Native Americans, in Northern Europeans, and in meaningful amounts among modern Mongolians, Central Asian peoples, and Northern Chinese populations. Geneticists sometimes use the term ghost population to describe a group like this, and it is an unusually fitting description once you understand what it means. A ghost population is a group that clearly existed and clearly shaped the ancestry of enormous numbers of people alive today, but left behind almost no direct trace of its own identity, no cities that have been confidently identified, no written language, no religious texts, no art that historians can point to and say with confidence, this belonged to them. Everything scientists currently know about the ancient North Eurasian population has been reconstructed backward, piece by piece, from fragments of DNA recovered out of a small number of ancient skeletons scattered from Siberia to the shores of Lake Baikal, dated to periods stretching back more than 20,000 years. Based on what has been recovered so far, this population appears to have been relatively small in number, highly mobile, and extraordinarily successful in one very specific sense, meaning their genetic descendants ended up scattered across an enormous portion of the northern half of the globe, even though the population itself, as a distinct and identifiable group, eventually vanished entirely from the historical record. This is where the story of heterochromia reconnects with that deeper history. When researchers went looking for the specific gene variants tied to light eye color inside the Tarim Basin genetic material and inside other ancient Siberian and steppe populations, they found those variants already present thousands of years before there was any concept of Europe as a distinct place at all. In other words, the raw genetic material capable of producing light eyes, and by extension capable of occasionally producing heterochromia, was not invented in one single location and exported outward to everywhere else the way the old textbook version assumed. It was already circulating through populations scattered across the vast stretch of Inner Asia long before. Recorded history began, carried by people who never called themselves by any name we would recognize today, moving along what would later become known as the Eurasian Steppe Corridor, a nearly unbroken band of grassland stretching from the region of modern Hungary in the west all the way to Manchuria in the east. That corridor matters enormously to this entire story, because it is arguably one of the single most important mixing zones in the history of our species. Horses were first domesticated somewhere along its length. Wheeled transportation spread outward along it. Entire language. Families moved and split apart while traveling through it. For at least 6,000 years before the first unified Chinese state ever existed, wildly different populations carrying wildly different genetic backgrounds collided along that grassland, intermarried, separated, and collided again over and over, generation after generation. Beginning around 5,000 years ago, groups carrying significant ancient North Eurasian ancestry began moving south and east out of the steppe into what is now Mongolia, into the Tarim Basin, into the Altai region, and eventually into the northern frontier of China, bringing horses, early bronze technology, and their genetic inheritance along with them. Over the following 3,000 years, fragments of that inheritance spread outward through marriage, trade, migration, and the countless small, undocumented interactions of ordinary daily life across an enormous stretch of the continent. Most people alive today who carry fragments of that inheritance look nothing at all like the original Tarim Basin population. The genetic material has been diluted, mixed, and folded into dozens of subsequent populations over the course of roughly 100 generations. But the fragments are still there, sitting quietly in the background of countless family trees. Every so often, in a child born to two parents who look completely unremarkable, whose family histories show no obvious connection to any of this deep history at all, those scattered fragments happen to line up in just the right combination during early development. One eye develops under the influence of one ancestral pigmentation pathway, and the other develops under the influence of a slightly different one. And the result is a child born with heterochromia, leaving the parents and grandparents completely baffled because there is no foreign ancestor anywhere in the family they know of, and no obvious explanation available to them. It is worth being precise here about exactly what the genetics can and cannot currently tell us, because this is a point in the story where an exciting narrative can tip over into something less honest than it should be. Heterochromia is not caused by a single gene switching on or off in response to ancient ancestry. It typically arises through the biological mechanisms already described: mosaicism, chimerism, or the ordinary unglamorous reality of eye color being shaped by more than a dozen interacting genes at once. What genetics has not yet produced is a single peer-reviewed study that precisely measures heterochromia's rate of occurrence against ancient steppe ancestry, the same rigorous way the origin studies for OCA2 and HERC2 have been measured and confirmed. That specific correlation currently remains a pattern that researchers and historians have noticed anecdotally based on clinical observation and regional reporting, rather than a formally published statistic. And it deserves to be presented honestly as an emerging hypothesis rather than fully settled science. Even so, the underlying pieces that support this hypothesis are all separately well documented and entirely real, including the ancient presence of light eye genetics deep inside Inner Asia, the historical reality of the steppe corridor as a genetic mixing zone stretching back thousands of years, and the biological mechanisms capable of producing mismatched eyes in the first place. What is not in dispute is a broader pattern that doctors and families across parts of Asia have quietly noticed for generations, without necessarily having any scientific language to describe it. Heterochromia is rare everywhere in the world, but it does not appear to be evenly rare. Clinical observations and regional reports describe it turning up somewhat more often in Mongolia, in parts of Kazakhstan, among Uyghur communities, and in pockets of northern China and Korea, compared with populations located further south and east that sit further away from the old steppe corridor. If that observed pattern holds up under more rigorous future study, the most plausible explanation is exactly the one suggested by the deeper genetic history uncovered through the Tarim Basin research, meaning that populations sitting closer to or more recently connected to that ancient mixing corridor are simply statistically more likely to carry the specific combinations of pigmentation genes capable of producing a mismatched result once in a while. This uneven distribution connects directly to something with real evolutionary stakes, because pigmentation genes were never really just about eye color to begin with. Melanin also plays a critical role in protecting skin from ultraviolet radiation. And as ancient human populations spread out of Africa and moved into regions with far less direct sunlight, natural selection began favoring lighter pigmentation in skin, hair, and eyes, because lighter skin allows more vitamin D to be produced from limited sunlight exposure, and vitamin D is essential for healthy bone development and for successful pregnancies, particularly in colder, darker climates, where sunlight is scarce for large parts of the year. In other words, the same underlying genetic toolkit responsible for occasionally producing two different colored eyes, though in a small number of people, is tied directly to one of the most important survival adaptations in the story of human migration: the gradual shift toward lighter pigmentation as populations spread into higher latitudes over tens of thousands of years. This means the small, unusual trait sitting quietly in someone's face today is a leftover fragment of one of the biggest survival stories our species has ever lived through, connecting a single individual's appearance directly to a process that shaped the biology of entire continents' worth of people over an almost unimaginable stretch of time. If a trait this small carries this much buried history, and you are the kind of person who wants to understand what your own biology is quietly telling you, this channel exists exactly for that. Because we treat every trait like this as a doorway into something much larger rather than a piece of disconnected trivia. Here's the part of this story that genuinely surprises even people who study genetics for a living. Heterochromia often appears to skip generations entirely, showing up clearly in a grandparent, disappearing completely for an entire generation with every child born looking perfectly ordinary, and then reappearing seemingly out of nowhere in a grandchild decades later. If heterochromia worked like a simple dominant or recessive trait, the kind taught using basic diagrams in introductory biology classes, this skipping pattern would not make any sense at all. But because heterochromia usually depends on an unlikely combination of several different genetic variants lining up together during the formation of egg and sperm cells, and then meeting a compatible combination coming from the other parent, it behaves less like a predictable inheritance pattern passed cleanly from parent to child, and more like a rare alignment of dice that might only come together successfully once every few generations within a single family line, even though the underlying genetic ingredients capable of producing that alignment have been sitting quietly in the family's broader gene pool the entire time. The rise of affordable consumer ancestry testing over the past decade has only made this pattern more visible to ordinary families who previously had no way to investigate it. Families in Mongolia, in Kazakhstan, and across parts of northern China and Korea have increasingly sent in simple cheek swabs expecting a tidy, familiar regional result, and instead received reports flagging a small but consistent component of deep steppe or Siberian-related ancestry, sitting alongside their expected regional profile, sometimes accompanied by notes referencing shared variants in exactly the pigmentation genes described throughout this story. None of this proves on its own that any single individual's mismatched eyes trace directly back to that ancient signal, since mosaicism and chimerism can and do occur in families with no unusual ancestry at all, but at a population level, looking across thousands of test results rather than any single family, the overlap between regions with historically elevated rates of reported heterochromia and regions with historically elevated ancient North Eurasian and steppe-related ancestry is difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. This pattern has also started to matter outside of genetics laboratories entirely. Historians studying the Silk Road, the era of Mongol expansion, and the deep history of China's western frontier have begun rereading older written sources in light of what this genetic evidence is revealing. Descriptions written by medieval travelers, including Arab and Persian chroniclers, of unusual light-eyed appearances. Among certain steppe rulers and officials, long treated by later historians as probable exaggeration or simple literary flourish, are now being taken far more seriously, now that there is a documented genetic basis for light eyes having existed quietly in that region for thousands of years, before any of those travelers ever picked up a pen. If you or someone you love has heterochromia, it is worth taking a moment to sit honestly with what the science can responsibly tell you it might mean without overclaiming what it cannot. It does not prove a specific, unbroken line back to any single ancient group with total certainty in any individual case, because mosaicism and chimerism happen for biological reasons that have nothing to do with deep ancestry at all, and plenty of heterochromia cases carry no exotic backstory whatsoever. What can be said, with genuine confidence, is that for populations sitting along or descended from that enormous historical corridor, stretching from the edges of Europe through the Central Asian steppe into Mongolia and northern China, the underlying genetic raw material capable of producing this trait has unquestionably been present quietly for an extraordinarily long time, long before anyone in that lineage had ever heard the word Europe, long before there was anything called a Silk Road, and long before any of the empires that later rose and fell across that landscape had a name at all. There are still real open questions in this field, and it is worth being upfront about them rather than pretending the picture is fully settled science. What is well supported by the Tarim Basin sequencing and by the broader mapping of OCA2 and HERQ2 across ancient Siberian and steppe populations is that the raw genetic ingredients for both light eyes and mismatched eyes were present deep inside Asia far earlier than the old European origin story ever allowed for, and that they never had to travel in from outside to eventually show up in Asian families. What remains an emerging hypothesis rather than a confirmed statistic is exactly how strongly heterochromia rates track region by region against specific ancient migration events. And honest science means holding both of those truths at the same time. 20 years ago, almost none of this could have been said with any real confidence at all. The sequencing technology needed to reliably read pigmentation-related genetic variants out of 4,000-year-old remains simply did not exist yet in any practical, affordable form. The Tarim Basin mummies themselves had already been excavated by archaeologists decades earlier, but had not been genetically analyzed at anywhere near this level of detail. The very concept of an ancient North Eurasian population, as geneticists currently understand and define it, had not even been formally proposed yet. Nearly all of the strongest evidence supporting this entire story has arrived within roughly the last 5 years, which means we are living through the actual moment when the deep genetic history of Inner Asia is being read in real detail for the very first time in human history, not a story quietly handed down from some earlier generation of scholars, but one still being actively written right now, one sequenced ancient genome at a time. And to be completely clear, since this matters more than almost anything else in this video, heterochromia does not reliably predict your personality, your ancestry, your intelligence, or your destiny. It is not a mystical marker of anything, and it does not make anyone special, cursed, gifted, or fundamentally different from anyone else. It is a rare, mostly random outcome produced by an ordinary pigmentation system built from more than a dozen interacting genes, occasionally shaped by ancient genetic material that has been circulating quietly through certain populations for thousands of years. And nothing more mystical than that needs to be true for the story to be genuinely remarkable. So take one more look in that mirror, the same way you did at the very start of this video. If your eyes match perfectly, You are still carrying the exact same ancient pigmentation system as everyone else on the planet, simply expressed in an even, balanced way. And if your eyes do not match, you're not broken, and you're not hiding some uncomfortable family secret nobody wants to admit. You are carrying a small, visible trace of a genetic toolkit that has been quietly shaping human eyes for tens of thousands of years, moving across continents long before anyone alive today existed to notice it happening. If a trait, this small can carry a story reaching back this far into the deep grasslands of ancient Asia, it is worth sitting for a moment with what else your own DNA might still be quietly holding on to, waiting for the right question to finally bring it into the light.